All right, welcome everyone. We are on session, I think number 7, lucky number 7. And we have a fantastic subject for you today. And this subject is that of soil. And we've heard of the problems with the soil, lack of nutritional depletion in our foods, problems with the soil. We've heard of imbalances between fertilizers and the appropriate way to go about having what we call regenerative agriculture and prioritizing our relationship between ourselves, the food we eat, and the world that we live on, that nurtures us, takes care of us, that provides life and allows us to experience on this beautiful planet. And I would like to just go and do a brief introduction. We've had a few sessions for those of you who have been listening, as you know, multiple categories, multiple subjects, really kind of bridging from third dimensional science into the other dimensional aspects as a bridge for science and spirituality to come together and a way to carry us forward. And today, what we're really looking at is one of John's, I guess you could say, expertise, to say the least. He was one of the pioneering researchers that helped basically create regenerative agriculture before it was even called that. And he took an approach that was very holistic, one that allowed the relationship and wholeness between all moving parts of the system, using advanced physics and methodologies and technology development, and is still currently assisting those who are bridging and pioneering forward into a co-op with regenerative agriculture pioneers on the East Coast. And we're actually really lucky to have this topic coming up. Right now, we have different people making a push for saving the soil, such as Sadhguru, very well-respected Hindu guru in India, making a long tour of saving the soil. And today, we're going to discuss that at a more intimate level, a scientific one, a personal one, a spiritual one, because as we know, there is no separation of spirituality and science. In fact, neither of them exist without the other. They're very intimately tied together. And so we're going to start out with a personal aspect with this from John, on John's behalf, move into some of the technicals, and then ease into whatever is in the flow. So welcome, John, to this very special topic. We're looking forward to this, and this may be a two video series just on this topic, depending on how we feel after you come back from Vermont doing your pioneering regenerative consulting work over there. So how about we open up with a personal story and how you got involved in this and how this is relevant for you and how you started to pioneer this for the world.
Well, it goes back quite a ways for me, almost 60 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
When I did my undergraduate work in physics, and when I finished, I thought, well, I like the university, so maybe I'll do some graduate work, and a possibility for assistantship in physics came up. But at the same time, sort of serendipitously, kind of a chance opportunity, I learned about an assistantship in agriculture. And so I decided on that one because I could use my physics to work outside. And being outside is much more exciting to me than being inside.
Yeah.
And in physics, of course, you're inside. Like engineering, you're in labs and around a lot of machinery and technology. And I like that stuff. I always loved taking things apart and putting them back together. I was better at taking them apart than putting them together, though.
Yeah, most people are.
Yeah, most of us are. And I started my work then at the University of Minnesota, and it got immediately embroiled in the soil in a big way and didn't really know anything significant about it. But I learned a lot with my master's program, and concentrated mostly on the physics of the soil, temperature, moisture, uh, air movement in soil, freezing and thawing, how moisture moves, how plants take it up. And it worked with different plant systems. And another chance opportunity came up to move to Wisconsin and do a PhD. So I did that and did a lot of plant work, but you can't do plant work, to me, without dealing with the soil, because the plants form a kind of synergy with the soil. And the two of them form a holistic system. It's amazingly brilliant system. It's just hard to even appreciate fully how dynamic the interaction is between the plants, the microbes, and the soil itself. It's all those living things that make the soil actually a living body. But I got involved in atmospheric work and in forestry and a number of things before midway through my career, I started really concentrating on the soil. And so to me, it was important to get a physical understanding, physical and chemical understanding of the whole soil plant atmosphere system, because the thing all behaves like a unit. I mean, we fragment it in academia. We tend to fragment it and look at the little pieces isolated from other pieces, but that's not the way that thing works. You really need to have it all. And I started building a model, a computer model, to kind of keep track in a careful, usable way all the things that I had learned as I've gone along through my career over this almost 60 years.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's a lot of
so I could,
knowledge.
yeah, so it allowed me to deal with problems holistically that most people just didn't do. And because the knowledge ended up codified in a practical way in these codes, in these computer codes. And they obviously got pretty big, as you might guess. I mean, the atmosphere by itself is a challenging system to understand. Meteorologists spend their whole careers just with the atmosphere. And I'm only dealing with the bottom 100 meters of altitude, maybe. It is, or of height above the ground. And they deal all the way up to miles up into the atmosphere. But I have to interface with that. And then the plant, of course, the physiology of the plant, the anatomy of the plant, its structure, I mean, the dynamics, the biochemistry that's going on. And then the soil, the medium that anchors these plants, and the relationship that gets established here is one of the plants fixing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, using the energy from the sun through photosynthesis, ending up with carbon in a biochemical form in the plant. And then that carbon gets exchanged with the living organisms in the soil. I mean, and so the plant provides the carbon to organisms in the soil, and at the same time, the organisms in the soil will extract nutrients and various chemical components from the soil that the plant needs for its growth. So there is a transaction that's occurring at the root surfaces. And immediately around the root, it's really pretty fascinating because there's something called a mucigel, and it's kind of a gel-like substance, thin layer around the roots where there's huge amounts of exchange between the carbon supplied by the plant and the nutrients and chemicals, biochemical constituents that the plant can use that are obtained and sometimes synthesized by those microorganisms. I mean, and so there's even evidence that some of the plant roots are farming the organisms. So it's pretty amazing relationship there between the plant and its roots and the microorganisms. And one of the most powerful microorganisms in the soil are the fungi. There's, of course, different families of organisms, different species, different genera. I mean, there's bacteria, there's fungi, there's archaea, there's just a host of microorganisms in the soil that do things for the plant and for the soil. Mm-hmm. So at the same time, all of this is going on between the plant root and the microorganisms in the soil. It's also going on between the plant root and the soil itself, and as well as between the microorganisms and the soil itself. So the key, one of the key factors that to me and early on was going to be a make or break effect was how water gets stored and transported through the soil. Okay. Because all of this living material that's in the soil and in a dynamic relationship with the soil, all that living material lives on the water. The water is crucial. And this soil is a porous medium. Yeah. And it's made up of a lot of small particles. We usually characterize it by what we call the soil texture. You know, is it sand or silty or clay, or is it a mixture of the three? I mean, and we have about a dozen different soil texture classes. And the way that plants modify those soils to make them suitable for themselves to grow is different for those different soils. I mean, so the water relationships are life and death in the soil. And a soil without life in it is more like a geological material. Like you take a rock and pulverize it, and that's a soil without living material in it, so, these plants and such. And that's not very interesting to study. But you get a soil that's a mixture of various textures, sand, silt, and clay, and then interacting with the vegetation and the microorganisms. And you form a really complex system that operates in a really almost unimaginable way to think about this whole system, because the plants and the microbes are modifying the soil so that it stores more water. It allows water to be conducted in faster and more stored in the system than would be without the life in there. And the life needs that water because the source of rain is usually episodic. I mean, it's intermittent. Yeah. It comes in a day and then you go for a week and maybe you get some more, or maybe you go for a month and maybe you get some more. So you need the storage. Yeah. The water storage. But the only way that you can get the water to store it into the soil is to have a way of getting it into the soil quickly. And usually in a homogeneous medium, a medium that's, say, all made up of glass beads the same size, if you move something through it quickly, it usually stores less. So the faster the water goes into a glass bead column, the less water that it stores or it'll hold on to. The plant and the microbes and the soil itself have this synergistic relationship with each other, so they actually can take the water in extremely fast,
Wow.
extremely fast, and store a lot in there at the same time because of the way that the plants and the microbes build the actual structure of the soil. That structure is the life and death of the plants and the microorganisms, because it's the key to what happens to the water. So it's a magnificent system, and just incredibly complex. We're just barely now starting to understand how this whole system works, and the destruction we've accomplished with our modern techniques, where in many ways, we've destroyed this synergy between the plants, the microorganisms, and the soil in favor of dumping vast amounts of chemicals, mostly chemicals, into the soil.
I was going to ask you where we went wrong. Where did we go wrong?
Well, that's a good question. That's a really, really good question.
A lot of people have an idea.
Well,
you mentioned the synergy, the relationship, the synergistic relationship that basically organism, you consider this a very complex organism with relationships and synergy, and replacing that synergy with chemicals. And would that be a yield-driven approach?
Yes, it's exactly. I mean, I think one of the weaknesses of science is that it tends to be done on the basis of, say, the rate limiting factor. What factor of the many that are obviously important in a system, any natural system, what limiting factor do we want to concentrate on to get an idea of how to improve this system? So it turns out that has to be something that's easy to measure. It has to be something that's economically important. And it has to be something that you can key off of, so that you focus your measurement energy on a limited number of variables, because there's 1,000 variables in this system. I mean, and you can't do that. Science can't handle that many variables. It can handle a few, a handful, maybe that many. That's even a lot. A lot of times it's that many, right? In the case of agriculture, it became the yield. So the biomass. How much living mass can you extract from that system that humans can consume, or that animals can consume, so the humans can consume the animals, right? So either directly or indirectly, how much mass of material.
And
now there's a lot more to food than that.
Yeah, I was just going to ask for the audience real quickly before we go too further down the line, the synergy here. If you actually target one factor, a limiting factor for yield, is it safe to say that that synergistic relationship is compromised that you were talking about earlier?
Well, I think that starts to happen as soon as you focus on one variable like that.
That everything shifts.
We've been focusing on that variable for thousands of years.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
But it was different. It was done a different way before the technology really came in and started to change it about the time of the Industrial Revolution. Because prior to that, you had very limited ability to alter the chemistry and the structure of the soil. It took a lot of energy. If you take a shovel and start turning the soil over and decide that you want to do this in a garden big enough to just feed your family, 4 of you, well, you give that up pretty fast because that's back-breaking work. And you have to do it for acres. Do you know how big an acre is? And an acre is big. When you start digging it up a shovelful at a time, an acre is huge, right? So animals were used. Animals were connected to devices to turn over the soil and plant seeds in it and such. And most of the time that allowed farmers to grow things and find shortcuts that work better than just a wild field of who knows what. I mean, because you're trying to plant things that you can eat.
Yeah.
You're not trying to feed the soil. You're not trying to help nature here. You're trying to feed your family, right? So you modify it. And we've been doing that for thousands of years. And we've modified it enormously from moving about 10,000 plus years ago as hunter-gatherers, and then settling into agriculture. And this is how the population dominated. So picking biomass was the obvious thing to do.
Okay.
When the technology rolled in. And I don't know if you've seen pictures of some of the tractors and some of the machinery in the 1800s when
No.
they were run on steam.
Oh, just like we could have done with cars.
Oh, they're massive, massive machinery. I mean, they just literally destroyed the soil to move on them. Big lugs
Wow.
on the wheels and heavy, like, well, imagine, take a small version of a steam locomotive and go out on the soil with it and pull a plow or something. I mean, you just destroyed it. I mean, so they pretty fast went to gasoline and all of these things, but all along they've been using biomass. And so they just continued to do it. And the technology got more and more intrusive in the system, right? I mean, basically, I think it's fair to say there were 3 major revolutions in agriculture that went through fits and starts to get to occur. The first one was machinery. So
Okay.
you churn the soil up, loosen it up so the plant roots can get a head start.
Okay.
And what that does is it rips apart all the fungi, right? So now one of the most important microorganisms you got in the soil, you're chewing it up every spring. Right?
I think
So
that's an important point for the audience to. That's an important point that you mentioned, the fungi being essential, a huge glue component to that synergistic relationship of the organism of the soil.
Yeah.
And by churning it over, you're compromising one of the most important components.
You are.
Okay.
I mean, it's as if you build your log cabin for your family to live in, and then the next spring a storm comes through, destroys the whole thing, and you got to build it again. Well, you never really get the thing finished before it gets destroyed again. So this is what the fungi are going through in the soil when you till it and work it like they do.
Okay.
So that was one of the first revolutions that started in the 1800s. And then came the chemical revolution, which really took hold in a big way post-World War I, but even bigger post-World War II.
Okay. It's
so
interesting
the companies, timing. Well, it's not by accident that World War II was involved in this, because the companies that provide the chemicals, the Dow Chemical and the the various chemical companies, those companies were companies that made munitions in the Second World War. Those were companies that helped the US to preserve its freedom in this world conflict that took place over, what, 4 or 5 years in the early 40s, yeah, late 30s and early 40s. Well,
It's an interesting transition from munitions to food.
well, it was a natural one because the munitions require these similar chemicals. Ammonia and nitrate are the chemicals that you use to fertilize, nitrogen fertilize plants, but they're also the chemicals you use to build explosives. Right? So it was a natural transition to do. And when the war ended, of course, you had all this capability with these artificial processes, this process called the Haber-Bosch process for producing ammonia and nitrate fertilizers. And they built fertilizer plants around the world and started fertilizing more. So then eventually you get other phosphorus and potassium, which become the big 3 nutrients that are fertilized every year on most every acre of cropland in the US. You put these fertilizers on. So the chemicals were the second revolution, and now the third revolution is the genetics, modifying the genetics of the plants. And there's a little bit of effort trying to deal with the genetics of the soil organisms, but the soil organisms are really, really hard to manipulate. They don't fall in line like the plants do. The plants are pretty big. They're individual. You can modify one plant and then multiply what you do with more and more reproduction, and eventually get seeds that you then use to plant in the fields and get your crops to grow.
Okay.
But in the process of using these chemicals, you find out that both the fertilizers and even more the toxins, the pesticides, what happens is you kill off a lot of the predators of the potentially problematic diseases. All right, the predators of the propagation, how do you want to say, the prey that prey on the plants and cause diseases and ruin the biomass production of the plant.
Mm-hmm.
The forms of the how do you want to, you have the prey and the predator, all right, and the predator populations are more vulnerable to most of the pesticides than the prey is. So what happens is that you put a pesticide on there to kill a mite or a beetle or some other insect. You spray a pesticide on there, it kills more effectively. It kills the predators for that. So what happens is you have to keep putting more and more chemical on there, and eventually the predators get resistant to it, and the chemical doesn't work. Now you needed to get another chemical, and each time you need to get a stronger chemical. And in the end, you're destroying the whole microbial balance that was there before you started doing all this disruption.
What about the food people are ingesting? What does that have to do? How does that affect the food?
Well, what happens is you don't get any nutrients in the plants.
That's what I feel when I go to the grocery store and I spend a bunch of money on organic groceries, and then I cook it, and I'm, in my Zen zone. I go in and I'm trying to take care of my body. An hour after I eat, I don't even feel the nutrients being absorbed by my body anymore, by the foods that I'm buying.
Yeah, it's because in the process of trying to select plant types that maximize the biomass, you change the content of that biomass, right? So the content, what's making up that biomass, which is what we're looking for when we eat that biomass, or the animal's looking for when the animal eats that biomass, the content of various nutrients in there changes with all of these practices. Because some of the availability of nutrients in the soil is determined by the microorganisms, many of which you've destroyed with the toxins and fertilizers and such. And so in general, what tends to happen is you get more biomass, but you don't necessarily get more nutrients. So if you double or triple the total biomass, say you double the biomass, so now instead of getting 100 bushels per acre of corn, now you're getting 200 bushels per acre of corn. Well, what happens to the nutrient concentrations in there? Well, they all go down, right? Because the nutrient concentrations are limited by the nutrient that's available in the soil. And you generally, every year, you don't replenish all those nutrients you've taken out.
So
right?
would it be safe to say that one of the directions, and I know I'm jumping the gun a little bit on this one, but just why we're here, that instead of looking at biomass was directly associated with feeding more people and making more money, right? That's the idea.
Yeah.
But in truth, why do we need food? We need food for what? Nutrients. Right?
Yes.
So there comes in the question, right?
Yeah.
Prioritizing nutrients, quality instead of quantity. This is something, obviously something that would be a different perspective based on who you're asking. For people who care about their bodies, who are health-centered, going to the grocery store or going to their local co-op or their local farm-to-table provider, nutrients obviously are going to be priority number one. So maybe, as they already know, a lot of people would be interested in this podcast are going to know that that's where we need to go, is that the nutrients and all that's obvious, yes. But as this kind of develops moving forward, when we start to look at the parallels of soil and the plants and our gut, and the dependence on the microbiome, when we start to really look at this relationship a little bit deeper, I would just keep in mind that we want to have, it starts out with one goal of a particular subset of individuals involved in agriculture would be to get as much biomass as possible and make as much money as possible and feed as many people as possible. Where there's a huge movement now, especially in the Oregon area where I'm living, and regenerative agriculture, where nutrients are a priority. Not having a big corporate agricultural framework, but really that moderate, small to moderate mom and pop approach where the nutrients are first and foremost, right? So it would be kind of a transition from the corporate agricultural system, not to mention GMOs, we don't need to even go into that yet, but to a more pocket, grassroots, nutrient-oriented agriculture. And what is that sweet spot before it turns back in on itself and becomes a money-making machine again? These are all interesting topics, but I just wanted to bring that to the floor and allow you to continue to elaborate. John, you're doing a great job. I appreciate this very much.
Well, it's a complicated business because certainly our ability to produce food grew enormously with industrial agriculture, with big tractors, with chemicals, and that. But some other things grew as well, and water pollution, how would you say, greenhouse gas productions, which we now realize is more relevant than we thought at the time we were doing it and building that agricultural system. And this is a characteristic of science, right? I mean, in science, you're never done. Science is never finished with anything. And you move along until you see an advancement you can commercialize. Then you commercialize it. And then you deal with the consequences. This is how the free enterprise system works.
Yeah, good point.
The problem is that you don't internalize the cost to the production system. You externalize the consequences to the community at large.
Ooh, that's a good point.
The government. Okay?
Yeah.
So now when you have a well that you can't consume the water from anymore because it's got pesticide residues in it, it's got too much nitrogen in it, and you might even have some of the organisms, biological organisms in there that are not supposed to be there, like coliform bacteria, right? So now you have to pay for this. The farming system that did this to your water supply isn't paying for it. That system externalizes the cost to the community. And so this is a failure of the economic system, that if the economic system were set up in such a way that the consequences was borne, that the cost of the consequences was borne by the people who generated the problem, then the problem would have been ameliorated, would have been addressed long ago. Because in that system, then the farmer would start to realize, boy, this groundwater moves around, and now I've got to pay for the water purification of all my neighbors. He's going to go to the chemical company and say, I don't want to use those chemicals anymore. I can't afford them anymore. I'm paying for all of this groundwater that these people can't drink anymore. Well, all of a sudden, the chemical companies would find other ways to do what they're trying to do. They're innovative. They would find another way to do it where you don't contaminate the groundwater. So it's what we've really suffered from here is a failure of the economic system, because by agriculture being able to export all the consequences of what they're doing, it looked cheap, and it was cheap. It kept food at a low price. But now we have environmental issues that are coming in at very high prices, very, very high prices, because not only did this externalizing consequences happen in agriculture, it happened in the chemical industry, it happened in the mining industry. This happens, the economic system is designed like this. And there's a really fundamental reason why.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Yeah.
Well, and the reason why is that it's so far, it's virtually impossible to quantify the value of the ecosystem to our economic system. All right, we haven't got any fungible quantities that we can build an economy, an economic model on, like money, right? I mean, money is a fungible quantity, and our economic system runs on all of this money. So it's the common medium of exchange for exchanging things in a free market. But how do you assess the monetary value of a healthy soil versus an unhealthy soil? I mean,
So
we don't even know for sure what that word healthy means when we apply it to a soil. There's lots of argument about what a healthy soil is still in soils, right? So
they still don't know.
No, they don't know. So in a sense, it's not necessarily the economist's problem either, right? It's the services that we get from the environment that we live in, and all of our sources of food and air, clean air, healthy food, water, the natural system that provides this is treated external. to our economics system, which is internal.
So,
This is a flaw
so you're talking
in the
about,
free enterprise.
you're talking about an ecologically backed system, if you could do it, if you had a way to do it,
Well,
like a
right
value.
now, yeah, if we had had a way to do this post World War II, so that we could have assessed what the consequences were, but we didn't know what they were, right? Well, if we don't know what something is, because face it, the concentration of ignorance when it comes to the natural environment is unfathomable. Humans have this enormous blind spot
Well,
on the value of the natural world to them.
some are
until-
ignorant, John, some are not.
Some are not, but
Okay, some are not.
the problem is that our institutions are blind to it.
The institutions, yeah.
The institutions are made up of us, human
Yep.
beings.
Yeah.
So these institutions in this hierarchical system that we live in, these institutions are the vehicle by which we balance these things. And we would have had a chance if we had expended 50% of our resources in agriculture and 50% of our resources in the natural environment. Suppose we split the investment that we make in growing more crops and only spend half as much as we would like to, and the other half we spend on the consequences of doing this, so that the research happens on both fronts at the same time. So you start monitoring the groundwater and you start monitoring what's exported from the system. You monitor the quality of the plants, right? So progress would be a lot slower, but you wouldn't have created the disaster that we're dealing with now. Because I think in general, humans don't have a lot of incentive to do that, because it's their children or their grandchildren who are going to have to deal with the consequences of their actions. So the people who did this stuff will be long gone by the time the consequences are quantifiable.
It's a lack of unity consciousness.
It's a lack of unity consciousness right down the line. And by working in this reductionist approach we take to everything we do, to the economy, to the, we're working from the bottom up in every technological area that we choose to look at. We look at the cars we're producing now. There's consequences to the cars we're producing now. And our economic system is still externalizing those costs. The mining costs, the poisonous chemicals.
Well, that's also how they maintain profit and maintaining their benefits.
But
right?
we could change the rules of this system. Governments, if they weren't so connected to the commercial sector, if they were truly an independent organizational structure.
If they were truly representing the people.
Yeah, if they were representing the people, it's those governments that set the rules. I mean, and we're a rule-based, whenever you go from the bottom up, you have to be a rule-based system. And so you make the rules, and then the economic system will use those rules. And those rules deal with consequences. You have to know something about the consequences before you move it ahead. Now, when we do some of this in medicine, we've tried to do that. Vaccines, for example, there's a reason it takes 10 years to produce a vaccine, because you have to be sure of what the consequences are.
Well, that's been thrown out the window as well, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, and that we've cut that shorter, and now there's more consequences that we're having to solve after the fact than there were before on other vaccines. There've always been consequences, but we've had some sense of what they are, and the numbers have been limited. That doesn't make the people who suffer from the consequences any happier. But it's still that strategy of building the consequences into the investment to begin with And
That's
you
that's a
can't really,
self-control structure. That's a self-regulatory mechanism to
it
prevent
is,
that prevents self-destruction.
yeah,
So it's a
all right,
self-regulatory mechanism. It's a homeostatic mechanism built in place, and that's more about how nature works,
right.
right?
And agriculture is the poster child for all of this
Okay.
because agriculture has to deal so completely with the natural environment.
Uh-huh.
The soil itself, which is, I mean, a matter of ownership and rights and these kinds of things, um, that a person has the right to do with that soil what he chooses. He might or might not have the right to mine some valuable quantity that's below the root zone, but depending on where you are. But in agriculture, you have to live with the environment. You have to live with the weather. You have to live with the soil. You have to live with the groundwater. You have to live with the rainfall, right? And all of these elements are in agriculture. And we've set up a system of supports through the government mostly to try and handle the 10 or 20% of the agricultural system that's going to fail every year. And you just hope it's going to be failing in different places every year. So you can bail out a place that fails because there was a drought there, but there will be enough rain in 80% of the area. So that problem area keeps moving around. I mean, and people can survive on that system.
So if we
So
look,
they've, we've thought about some of those elements of it, but we haven't thought about the consequences on the soil. And the consequences for the soil have been mostly negative, if not completely negative. The key constituent that you need to maintain in the soil to maintain your agriculture is something that's called the soil organic matter. It's the
soil
dead,
organic matter.
yeah, it's the dead bodies of all of the roots and leaves or whatever else goes into the soil. It's the dead bodies of the microbes, of all the little fauna, which are the small animals in the soil, the small bacteria, the fungi, all these things, they have living and dead components, and those dead components become modified into a material we call soil organic matter that's unbelievably complex.
Okay.
It's incredibly complex material.
And what about the relationship of water to the soil and organic matter? Is that very important there?
Oh, it's crucial.
So if you
crucial.
lose water, you have a drought, or somehow we have a drought or something, you're not getting your water. What happens to the soil and organic matter?
If the water diminishes steadily from year to year, the organic matter gets burned off by the heat. So in other words, without the water, the organic matter cannot be continually turned over.
Mhm.
So I have to remember that these organisms live for a while and then they die, and their organic matter is their bodies, and then the new organisms that start to grow are growing off of the dead material in there from the past, right? So
Okay.
there's a cycle here that's going on in the soil. And if you have lower temperatures and more water, then you build up the soil organic matter. If you have higher temperatures and less water, the organisms burn off this organic matter. And
Okay.
pretty soon you don't have enough to sustain an economically viable crop anymore because the organic matter gets too low.
How long does it take to rebuild the soil organic matter as you gradually increase water over a period of time?
Well,
say it's depleted.
I think that's a really good question, and I think you could get a lot of answers to that.
What's the range, would you guess, if you could guesstimate, they call it?
Well, people often use the term topsoil to represent highly productive soil that has adequate soil organic matter in it.
Okay.
And the nature, numbers for nature vary widely, but typically the number that the soil scientists tend to use is if you want to build 1 inch of topsoil naturally just through nature, it's going to take 1,000 years.
1,000 years.
Yeah, to add 1 inch of organic matter. Now, what we've learned is that the challenge with nature is that it's not just designed to build organic matter. Nature is evolving the whole system from
Okay.
the top down, the whole system. So any one component of that system is going to evolve slowly.
Mhm.
That's why we have millions of years for things to change. But we come along and we can concentrate changes,
Mhm.
right? We can concentrate change, and that's what we've done with our technology.
Okay.
And so in 150 years, we've driven off 50 to 75% of the organic matter that it took tens of thousands of years to build up. And in 150 years, we've burned off maybe 2/3 of it, something like that.
Wow.
Certainly more than half of it, and probably more like 2/3. And
Hmm.
it doesn't go off evenly. It's not like 2/3 everywhere, because I remember when I was at the Nebraska, at the university there, that there were sections of southeastern Nebraska that grew corn for 50 years and then
Mhm.
stopped growing it. And if you look at, well, why did they stop growing it? Why did there's no more corn growing in these areas in southeastern Nebraska? And you find out that there's not enough topsoil to grow corn anymore. You need something like 6 inches to a foot of topsoil to really have a healthy corn crop. And they have maybe 3 inches. We've lost all that topsoil from wind erosion and water erosion,
Mhm.
so that you can't grow corn there anymore. So these kinds of things are happening in places where you're using the same farming practices in places that have high organic matter and places that have low organic matter. And the
Okay.
places that are more vulnerable, you can't farm there anymore, right? You have to pick and choose what you can grow because you don't have the water storage capacity anymore. So these things are sort of secondary in our considerations of how we do agriculture,
So
because it's hard to characterize soil. It's really, really hard to characterize soil.
okay.
I mean, and it's a regenerative material. It will regenerate itself if you just quit farming it.
Uh-huh.
It will regenerate itself. When you go look at these areas where they've neglected them because the farm has gone bust and it isn't sold and other people don't want it, it's too hard to reclaim all that land. It's full of weeds, brush, trees and things are starting to grow on it. A lot of that soil that's not good enough for agricultural crops, you can grow other crops on it. You can grow forest crops on it. I mean, and other things.
See,
But
that's a great idea.
well, except that we have problems handling all of those sorts of things socially.
Uh-huh.
You
Yeah.
have a housing development, you don't want a forest next to you, or maybe you do. You buy the land so you can plant the trees there. And so you plant your own forest around your house so that you have some privacy, or who knows? A
Yeah.
lot of crazy things can happen. But the soil itself, an appreciation for the living component. Science doesn't deal with life real well. It just doesn't, life just doesn't behave in a way that we are comfortable thinking we can control it. Life gets away from us. I mean, look at the pesticide community. I mean, how fast these microbial colonies will develop a resistance to the best chemicals and genetic modifications we can do. and they'll outdo us. And they keep doing it over and over again. They keep doing it, and we keep fighting with them instead of trying to work with it.
Yeah,
Right?
I think
Or-
beating nature into a sledgehammer instead of utilizing the innate ability and consciousness of nature to provide, which is designed to do for longevity.
But it's bigger than we are.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
It's bigger than we are. And we're going to lose this battle. And we don't have to lose it. That's really the point. We're smart enough not to lose this battle.
And what do we have to do to not lose this? So that's where we are. You answered where we are. What went wrong?
Well,
What
to
is
me-
regenerative agriculture? What is regenerative agriculture? Where are we headed? What's going on in that realm?
I would say for the most part, regenerative agriculture is a very tiny renegade movement.
Tiny renegade movement. Okay.
Yeah, that's not catching on big very fast because it's internalizing the cost of growing food,
Ah,
and it's competing with a major established community of people who are externalizing the consequences for their practices. And so it's fledgling, and it'll likely stay fledgling. Even if you look at nutrient quality of food in the experiments that have been done on farm areas that have been in regenerative agriculture for 10 or 15 years.
okay.
And you look at the nutrient quality compared to industrial agriculture or organic agriculture,
Okay.
and you'll find that some nutrient contents are 3 or 4 times higher than they were in industrial and organic, right? Because the organic movement has never really abandoned tillage, right? The biggest
Yeah.
problem in organics is the weeds, because you can't use the chemicals on the weeds. And so at least not the artificial ones, the synthetic ones, which are the ones that are widely used in agriculture. You can't use those. So how do you deal with the weeds? Well, some of them have torches and they burn the weeds off, and sometimes they till between the rows of their crop, and that cuts all the fungi, so you don't get a regenerative type soil in that system. They are trying hard, and there are now some practices in organic agriculture that are improving dealing with weeds and not tilling the soil, right? So the organic movement is moving much more quickly into the regenerative community. Those two communities are coming together. Industrial agriculture is simply opposed to both of those. And so within industrial agriculture, they're pretty much going their own way. And that's the 800-pound gorilla, right, in the economic side of agriculture. And it isn't obvious to me that there's any movement, serious movement in the chemical or industrial agriculture community to move to regeneration. The big companies are exploring it, and they're trying to do things in this arena, but there's a fundamental problem they're facing.
What's that?
Well, the fundamental problem they face is that the regenerative system reduces the inputs. So the individual farmers who can make a living at regenerative farming have to charge more for their product, right? So
Yeah.
the prices are more like organic, or even sometimes above organic. But the basic way you go from industrial agriculture to regenerative agriculture is by reducing your inputs. So you don't you taper off your fertilizers, you reduce the amount of fertilizers, the chemical fertilizers,
Mhm.
and you use debris, detritus, the dead plant materials, you leave
Mhm.
them in the soil. You build up the root systems, you rotate your crops. So you use practices that are well established, and they were used for hundreds of years before they stopped using them. And you can build up the soil organic matter and build up the nutrient content naturally. And it takes 5 to 20 years, depending on the soil and where you're starting from, to make a big difference.
It's not too bad.
No, it's doable.
That's doable, which
It's
is great.
doable. But you can see how it's going to be hard for a commercial entity to make money off of less input.
So it comes down to the system again, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, because instead of spending 25% of the value of your crop in corn on fertilizers and pesticides and chemicals and things, you don't spend that. Now you may have to taper it for 5 years. You can't just stop. That could be a crisis for you. But some farmers do. They just cold turkey. They stop doing the industrial agriculture and they start doing the other. And there's a lot of things you have to do to undo the damage that industrial agriculture has had on the soil. Pans, you get these hard layers that roots can't even penetrate, maybe less than a foot down into the soil, where the plow pushed down, compacted the soil, and it's so compacted the roots can't get through. We have to break those things up. So there's special equipment that you have to reclaim that land and start doing regenerative work. But you can see how you have less energy input, right? You might have one medium-sized tractor instead of one mammoth tractor. You might farm 300 acres or 400 acres instead of 3,000 or 4,000 acres, right? And you have less energy input, you have less chemical input. Your equipment costs are much lower. You don't have the variety of equipment. So it's a different business altogether. But it's hard to see how a commercial entity can make a lot of profit off of that system. Right? And so it's going to take time for the conversion of the mass of our agricultural land to regeneration.
Mhm.
It's hard to imagine this happening quickly. I think small to medium farmers will be able to do the conversion sort of one at a time, or one field at a time, or a quarter of their farm at a time, or 10% of their farm. And slowly convert the area over. Because with lesser inputs and a little higher value to the crop that you produced, then you can still make a profit. So the regenerative farmers now can still make a profit, but it takes an enlightened community of consumers to be willing to pay for that, because quality is not a measure. The quantity of different nutrients, which we call the quality of the crop, that's not measured routinely. No one knows this from any production source. Right? And so there's no metric that's available to say this food is more valuable than that food.
Mhm.
Except now, I would say with meat, it's becoming clear that animals that graze on pasture are healthier animals to consume than animals that grow up in feedlots. Now, there's still arguments about that. There's some people who say they're not that different, and there's other people that say they are that different. So there's a lot of controversy. So it's not real clear. But there is more evidence building that feeding the animals out in the pasture, right? They do a number of things for the soil when you have the animals feed that way. Number one is they defecate, of course, all over this land, and you've got these cow pies everywhere, or animal pies, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
And then they, with their hoofs, they stomp those things into the soil, and they stomp the vegetation down into the soil, right? And that's decomposed and adds nutrients and organic matter to the soil. So you're doing all of this at the same time that the animal is being fed. And it turns out that the saliva from the animal actually stimulates the growth of the plant.
Wow.
So this is how this system operates. This clearly the natural system runs from the top down. and the more study that's done of the whole system, the more you realize that the consequences are positive in a regenerative and negative in an industrial system.
Yeah.
Because the industrial system operates separate from nature. It basically is extractive of nature. Our agriculture is like our mining industry. It's extracting the resource. Now it's extracting it slower and slower as it disappears. So when you had 3 feet of topsoil, it took you 100 years to have 2 feet. And then it took you another 100 years to have a foot, right? And then maybe it takes 200 years to get down to an inch. It slows down, right?
Yeah.
And I think the industrial farming community has tried to restore it as much as it can. There's much more minimum tillage. There's much more use of green manure, as they call it, cover crops that they plant in the spring or fall to keep the soil covered, to minimize tillage. These are all things that can be done in industrial agriculture to help to restore the soil. So it's not as though there's nothing that can be done. There are things that can be done and are being done, actually. It's just that it's a little late to be realizing that it's not wise economically to externalize the cost of an innovation. You need to the consequences to externalize the cost of the consequences of an innovation from the benefits of that innovation.
But isn't that the first thing that the corporate companies do, is externalize the costs? Is the first thing that they try to do?
Well, I don't know that.
Within the system itself.
Well, I think the flaw is in the system, not in the individual companies, because I think that if you change the system so it was a level playing field for everybody, I don't think that the corporate interests would fight that.
Okay,
I
that's
think
good to
they
know.
know what's happening. No, I think too, they want to sustain their corporation.
Yeah, they want to survive.
Well, they want to survive, and it's pretty clear that survival is going to get harder and harder and harder as the soil becomes more and more and more damaged.
Yeah.
But the problem is that the first company that takes on the challenge of dealing with the external costs of the external consequences,
Good point. Yeah.
they're going to go bust.
Yeah.
So in this economy, any free enterprise economy needs redistribution inherent in it. No free exchange economy is ever going to function very long in a very equitable way without a redistribution component, right? And it's something known as the Pareto law. I mean, Pareto worked through this in the exchange. When you have exchanges, I mean, for example, you and I have 2 coins and we flip coins. And you call one, I call one, you call one, I call one. And what's the end result of this? If they're perfect coins, they're perfect 0.5 for heads and 0.5 for tails, so 100 digits. Okay, so it's perfect. How is that going to end up if we go a very long time? One person is going to end up with all the coins, guaranteed. The only thing that determines that is how long you go. If you only play for a couple of flips, no, it doesn't stop. But if you play it long enough, one person ends up. If you have exchanges like in a free enterprise system or in an open free market, you have all these exchanges. The ultimate end of that is all the resources ends up in the hands of a few people, guaranteed. It works this way. This is the way it works in nature. This is the way it works in a free economy. And you need a redistribution function, right? And in nature, the redistribution function is consequences. If some organism gets an advantage, there will be some consequences to it for that advantage, and eventually it'll be pulled into check. Right? And if that doesn't happen, then you find major shifts that occur in nature. And you'll get the extinction of a bunch of species and the flourishing of a few others. But in a free economy like we're trying to build, if you don't have a redistribution system, and the best one to me is to internalize the consequences. That's the best redistribution function.
Okay.
But in the absence of that, we've tried to do it with taxes. We've tried to redistribute with various schemes for subsidies and manipulating the economic system to keep it from concentrating too much. But we haven't succeeded.
You haven't succeeded. Okay.
The inequities are bigger now than they've ever been, and they'll continue to get bigger and bigger because that's the natural way. This Pareto law applies to everything where you have these kind of random exchanges. So it's clear we have to do something about redistribution in this exchange economy. And agriculture is a good place to try to do it because we have to deal with nature.
Yeah.
We have to find a way to associate or assess the cost of the consequences of various actions that we take.
Well,
Even if it's the next generation that's going to bear the cost.
you can postpone it all you want, but from what I'm hearing in today's talk is that it's only a matter of time before the redistribution function or the consequences comes into effect for the current approach of agriculture and depletion and biomass loss. That it's only a matter of time that's just playing it's a matter of time before the consequences swallow that up.
Well, the impact that our food supply has on our health is pretty big. And we have a lot of epidemics that seem to be starting in the last 20 years. Health issues.
And you're attributing that to possible nutrient deficiency due to the food supply?
I think the food supply has played a role in that. And I think agriculture has some responsibility for the quality of our food. and the diminished quality of our food.
Yeah.
But it's not that anyone has any desire to foist shortcomings of what they're doing on somebody else. Nobody wants to do that.
Uh-huh.
I really don't. I believe there's so few people that want to do that. They're not worth worrying about. Most people want to deliver something to someone else in exchange for their monetary value. That's beneficial to that other person. And the food is beneficial. It's better than none, but it's not the same quality that it was a generation ago.
Yeah.
And that's clear. It's very clear. And we have our homes, we have 80,000 chemicals that are legal to sell to people, that they can keep in their homes and use in their homes, where they inhale the vapors from these. And a lot of them are questionable, I should say. I mean, I follow the Consumer Reports and some of the other consumer testing communities, and there's a lot of those 80,000 chemicals are dangerous chemicals that I will never have in my house. I can tell you that. I will never have them in my house, but they're legal and they're in a lot of people's houses. And they might do a job really well, except it's dangerous.
Yeah. I see that a lot.
Well, and so it's our system has in many ways has failed us. It isn't. We can do better than we're doing.
I know.
I know we can do better than what we're doing.
And you're helping people try to do better at this time.
Well, I don't know how much help I am, because I can talk about it, but I'm past the stage of really doing much about it.
Yeah, but you set forth a role, a scope of work within this topic of science for how many decades, how many publications, and how many citations do you have?
Well, but most of those are pretty specialized, and
I understand.
I was trained in the science system too for most of my career.
Yeah.
I didn't get involved in trying to do something to make a difference until near the end of my career. That's when I could afford to do it.
Yeah, ironically, that's when you can afford to do it. Absolutely.
I mean, because you're tenured and you can do what you think is important to be done instead of falling in line.
Yeah.
And most of my career, I fell in line like everyone else did. I mean, and
that's how it's built. Yeah.
So, in fact, what ultimately led to the decision in the 90s to start trying to do something that could make a difference was I went through an inventory of what I'd done, of the papers I published, of the research that I was part of. That almost all of it was done with other people. It was all collaborative, cross disciplines and such. But I couldn't find anything that I thought made a difference in the average person's life at all.
It's kind of where I was. I realized that.
Well, you realized it in a few years, and I went and did that for 30 years.
But in
before,
the end,
before I realized that.
But you were a pioneer for the regenerative agriculture.
Well, I did a lot of work in environmental biophysics, which is the kind of work that turns out now to potentially be useful in regenerative agriculture. But right now, it's not being used because it's a little bit too technical. And there's no infrastructure to help farmers deal with this. So right now, what's mostly happening is it's innovative people on the ground. It's farmers who are creative, intelligent, dedicated, and they've got some consultants, some of whom I've worked with and interacted with, that guide them and show them how to make this transition from an industrial practice to a regenerative practice.
And to me, that's one of the most important things you could possibly do.
Well, it is, but the part where what I've actually done can contribute to their transition is doesn't have any infrastructure supporting it, and the farmer is not capable of directly using it himself. He needs a company that will, or a cooperative of some kind that will
Yeah.
pool resources and get the technical people to do it, because some of the work that I've done can help a farmer assess what it takes on a particular piece of land in order to regenerate it. Because the problem with regenerative farming is it has to be tailored to every different patch of land,
Yeah.
because the soils are different in every patch of land. I mean, a soil that's high on the topography versus one that's low on the topography, they're going to take different practices in order to do regeneration on both of those. If one has more sand and one has more clay, there are going to be different practices they're going to have to do. They're going to have to farm it differently to be regenerative in both those cases. So the metrics that they need to assess their progress toward regeneration, right now, they don't exist. They just have to do this by the seat of their pants. They just got to do this by their feelings, right? By their intuition, their sense of, is this land doing better or is it not doing better, in some nebulous qualitative way. And some quantitative methods to do that, which I indirectly have worked on in my career without knowing that they would be helpful to regeneration. And they can be used in a new way to help farmers in this transition from an industrial design to a regenerative design. But it's challenging. There's a lot of challenges in this, and it takes extraordinary people to do it right now.
Yeah, I think that would be basically the rehabilitation project. Really, it's an agricultural rehabilitation. And you would need a team of consultants to be able to assist those to assess their particular lot, their particular land, and to have subsidies and support within some sort of cooperative or infrastructure to provide those renegades with the resources they need to put, if those putting their neck out a little bit,
right,
to be able to have a safety net so that it can actually be done, so that we can actually go forward with this rehabilitation process here.
Well, yeah, and there's a lot we could do, because right now we subsidize the people doing industrial farming, and we tax people doing organic farming.
Well, that's interesting. Maybe that should
Isn't it?
change.
Yeah, you have, the organic farmer has to pay in order to have his certification with the USDA, right? And so he has to pay to be organic, certified organic. But the industrial farmer gets a subsidy for the crop he grows.
Huh.
So we have a lot of choices here, and there are a lot of things we could do to facilitate this, but we don't have the incentive or initiative to take them on. That's, I don't know, maybe, what are we, a dying culture maybe? I mean, it's hard to know why we wouldn't take on the challenge of our future.
Well, I wanted this to be an uplifting topic, but this is the harsh reality. This is the harsh truth that we're dealing with. A lot of times
Well,
we have cracks, we have good times, but this is the science of soil as it stands today, I would say.
The government can forgive people for mistakes they've made in the past, but nature doesn't do this. Nature extracts the cost regardless of the consequences of extracting it. It just does. That's all. And so there isn't going to be a relief from this for us unless we participate in that in some balanced way. Unless we work with nature in a way that's successful. I mean, and it's possible to do. It's not even hard to do. We did it. Humanity did it for thousands of years. So it's possible for us to do this, but it's harder to undo a questionable practice than it is to just change what you're doing in some seemingly beneficial direction.
Okay.
Because when we made the choices that we made to give us our modern industrial agriculture, they seemed okay. And the masses didn't object to them.
But they didn't
Right.
know any better either, though,
We,
John.
we all participated in this.
No one's separate from it. That's another point. Yeah.
Yeah, we all participated in this. We can't blame the
Can't-
corporations. I
can't
don't
point the
think
finger.
that's fair.
Well, we put them in charge. We bought their products. You know, one of the ways you can start to change is not buying people who put poisons on their foods. Not buying foods that aren't, but they're expensive. And then we're also dealing with an economical issue here too. So the nutrient deficiencies are those to have less economic influence and abundance.
Yeah,
So we're a little bit of a pickle here, and you can't go around and point the finger. Although things are interesting, timing's interesting, and motivation's interesting, and the effects on the populace is interesting, and where the true power is versus representing the populace, right? That's kind of a common thing we've come across. But besides that, in order to make a change, we actually have to take responsibility no matter what. At an individual level and a collective level. It can't just happen. And I think you're right. We can't just point the finger, this or that. There's got to be a change. There's got to be logic. And that's where, that bridging of the science and the mind and preservation is really important at this point. Because you're going to have people who are in influential positions who know that that the time's, the clock's ticking.
it
Clock's
is
ticking.
Yeah,
It's past due. We should have been done, we should have been addressing this a long time ago. Another concern is population density. The yield of switching to organic and regenerative versus, for the population itself. So in my view, that means you'd have a bunch of smaller pods of growers and food sustainers instead of a big one where you're really tapped into that system. So one of the ways you can lessen the blow of the transition is to facilitate community, facilitate passion and understanding in the relationship itself with the earth. One of the things that we're not taught in standard society is that important relationship between ourselves and the earth, and that synergistic aspect.
Yeah.
And that growing your own food, it's not my expertise, but there's plenty of people who do this, and it's a passion, it's an understanding, it's a love, it's a relationship for them that provides happiness and connection and peace and purpose. And people who grow good food, who then sustain themselves and assist other people with the nutrients that they need. This is a form of love. This is a form of a relationship that has been lost, that is now coming and looking us directly in the face as a point of healing that needs to occur. And I think there's plenty of different directions we can take with this, but I think we're running out of time for today. And there's plenty of other areas that we can dive into. I know you're going to be going on a trip in the next few weeks. It's going to be really interesting to see and hear about how that goes with your work. You're working with a possible cooperative in Vermont. Is that right?
Yeah.
And a very intelligent man that you respect very much. What is his name?
His name is Abe Abraham.
That's right, Abraham. And so he's actually been very committed, and despite all the hoops and hurdles, and you're going to head out there because he requested some assistance with some technology that you built. And eventually, I think the audience would probably like to see more about that relationship with the food, with the earth, with the nutrients, with the biome, with the nutrients and the biomass, and the relationship in the soil to the relationship in the gut, and that symbiotic relationship. And then that relationship as a very integrative approach, a holistic approach, a parts whole, collective, where you're really looking at it as a relationship. And again, when we come to that relationship, it comes down to that function of love, the all-sustaining consciousness, being implemented back to this cultural approach. And what is that approach? The billiard ball function, if you remember that, of love.
The function of love, yeah. It's a point of function where two complementary forces in the presence of a third stabilizing factor exchange modes, and one becomes the other.
Exactly. So we're seeing that completely applied here as it is with everything else, but this is more of a dire situation, one that's a little scary to talk about, to be honest, with some of the statistics that we're looking at. So if we can stay optimistic, and when we stay open-minded, and we can use the knowledge that you have, John, and all the knowledge that's out there, and we could spread the word and understand this at a much deeper level, a logical level, where we're bridging the intellect with the intuition, right? You talked about the necessity of intuition for some of these renegade regenerative agriculturists. That's good. As we talk about the neat necessity of the intuition with the intellect at this point. So we need both. We're going to need the intellect and say, this is logical. Time is ticking. Okay, what are you going to do about this?
Yeah.
And then we turn, and then we turn it on. We allow ourselves to feed the field, feed the collective, and facilitate an integration process on this topic with people who are guided to do so. And we can only do what we can do, but we do so one step at a time. So for those out there, I hope you enjoyed this topic today. We're going to dive into this a little bit further. And I hope you enjoyed understanding this at even a deeper level. I know I did. For this is not necessarily one of my expertise, but hearing this and understanding this at a foundational level, and then some of the really interesting and palpable solutions that are out there. Something as so simple as prioritizing nutrients over biomass, not so simple, but conceptually sure. Making sure that externalization of from the economic impact of the consequences of capitalist agriculture versus internalizing it as a direct solution. So for the system changing in a positive way. These are all very great solutions and ideas, but that's what they are up to date, unless we find a way to implement them at the systems level. Otherwise, it's going to be a grassroots process, and that's fine. But these are all things to think about. I think you came up with some fantastic solutions and understandings and understandings as to exactly some approaches that would facilitate a rehabilitation. With that, John, I'm going to let you give the sign off today, since this is your expertise. So go ahead and give the sign off to the audience. Any last minute things, and we'll conclude to our next series, our next session.
I think the thought I'd like to leave people with is the soil is a absolutely beautiful and magnificent material that's under our feet all the time, and that our language and our culture has never really appreciated this. And if you doubt that, think of the words that are used in different ways, but they originate in concepts in the soil, like dirt, right? Or this when you insult somebody by saying they're underfoot, right? Like the soil is under your foot, which is an insulting kind of phrase.
Interesting.
So we tend to have words in our language that we use metaphorically that denigrate the soil. It's something that we dump stuff on. We don't really think very much about what we do to it and what happens underneath the surface as a consequence of what we do to it. And it's a beautiful, beautiful, magnificent medium with just teeming forms of life. I mean, billions and billions and trillions of organisms down there, all doing their thing and building their houses and making it so it sustains us. There was a book I read some years ago called Soil, the Ecstatic Layer of the Earth, the ecstatic surface of the earth. Is that it? That ecstatic layer covering the earth. So it's a teeming with life, and it's our sustenance. It's humanity's sustenance. There's no substitute for it. NASA's tried to figure out how to substitute for it so they could send people into space and have people go to Mars for a year or two and sustain them without soil. And they've just about given up on it because they just don't know how to do it. We don't know enough about this medium that sustains us to even take care of it. So respect it, love it. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And it's important to us, really important.
You've gone on to say that soil is life. Is that right?
Soil is life.
Okay, so we'll end on that. It's an honor always, John, and we'll meet back in a few weeks. Thank you, audience, for listening, and we have some more material coming your way very soon, so look forward to that. Remember that soil is life, and we shall talk and see you soon. Thank you.